So far we've learned about the two models that make up the SCR model, the density model and the detection model. We've spoken about detecting animals mostly, but did not really talk about what method of detection we would use. There are two main methods of detection, visual and acoustic detection. Visual means you record an animal when you see it. Acoustic means you detected it because you heard it. In this lecture, we're going to go completely acoustic and focus on detecting calls instead of animals. So now we'll use calls as the detection unit. We'll talk about spatial capture-recapture using acoustic detectors. We'll learn how to set up an acoustic capture history and how to turn call density into animal density. This requires estimating call rate, which we'll talk about how to do that. And last, we have some pros and cons of acoustic versus visual surveys and calls versus animals as the detection unit. We're going to start by using an example where animals make a bunch of distinct calls throughout the day or throughout the sampling occasion. Rather than detecting the individual animals visually or acoustically and creating records of the animals, we're going to detect the individual calls and record each call that we heard. So in the example shown here, instead of recording 3 animals, we record 9 calls. Why do we want to do this? Well, it can be very hard to detect animals or groups of animals visually, especially if they live in a dense forest where the visual range is very limited, like gibbons do. But these animals make sounds, or they might make sounds, for example calls, by which they can be detected from much greater distances. So you might not be able to see the animals, but you can hear them. So like I said, sounds travel much further than you would be able to see the animals. So for one, the calls that the animals make are much easier to detect and at much greater distance. But when we hear animals calling in the forest without seeing them, we don't necessarily know who is making the call. And when you hear multiple calls, it'd be very hard to determine if the different calls were made by the same animal or by the same group of animals, which is what you would need to do if you used animals or groups as the detection unit. So it might be much easier to record the individual calls instead and not have to worry about if the calls were made by the same animal or not. In this example, the black dots are the detectors as before, but now the colored dots are the individual calls that the animals made, or rather the location of the animal when it makes the call. And the colored lines point towards which detector detected the call. I color-coded them by the individual animals that produced the calls. So for example, animal 1 produced 3 calls marked in red. It moved a bit between making the calls, but we do not know that it was the same animal making the 3 calls. It turns out that we actually don't need to know this. So for now, we only know that we detected a number of calls at the various detectors. And what we do need to know is whether the same call was detected by multiple detectors. For example, this call up here in the top red was detected by D2 and D5. This one here was detected by D2 and D5. So we need to be able to tell that the call detected by D2 was the same call, same as the call detected by D5. We need to be able to match calls between detectors. In a sense, this call is marked and recaptured by D2 and D5. This creates the mark recapture events that we will use for our SCR analysis. The problem we have now, of course, is how do we match calls between detectors? There's a variety of information we have available. So for each call detection, we have the time that the call was detected at the detector. So these need to be recorded very accurately, not just to the nearest minute. and possibly the direction it was coming from. So the angle from the detector to towards the animal that made the call. So how could we get direction? For example, if each detector was a human detector, a person standing at a listening post for the duration of the sampling occasion, for example, they could record each call they heard along with the direction it was coming from, using, for example, a compass. But we'll keep it simple here and only use the time of detection to match the calls between detectors. We'll now use this plot to make the capture history for this example. And for this, we start out by giving each call an ID. We have 12 calls in total. So we have a table that looks similar to the capture histories we've seen in the previous lecture. But now the rows are the individual calls that were detected throughout the occasion, and the columns are still the detectors. For example, call 1 was only detected by detector 1, call 2 was detected by detectors 2 and 5, and so on. In this simple example, we use the time of detection as well. So for example, at 6:34:01, only one call was detected at D1 and at none of the other detectors. Hence, C1 is a call that was only detected by a single detector. At 6:34:52, on the other hand, a call was detected by D2 and D5. Hence, we assume this is the same call. At 6:49:06, a call was detected by 3 detectors, D10, 14, and 15, and we assume it was the same call, and so on. Of course, things are usually more complicated than in this oversimplified example. For example, 2 or more animals calling at the same time. But for now, we keep it simple and look at how we use this capture history for our analysis and what kind of consequences it has on the SCR model to use calls instead of individuals. As before, we have 2 models for SCR. One, we have the density model, but now we don't estimate animal density here, but call density. So instead of number of animals per unit area, this is usually expressed as the number of calls per unit area per unit time. So unit area, of course, is the hectare, as before. And time is the duration of your recording, unless you specify it in the model fitting function. So if your occasion lasted 2 hours, for example, then your density would be expressed as the number of calls per hectare per 2 hours. Second, we have the detection model, which looks similar as before with the same shape and 2 parameters to estimate, but this function now models the probability of detecting a call and not the probability of detecting an animal. These are two different things. Overall, we still have 3 parameters to estimate as before, but the end result is not density of animals, but density of calls. Generally, we were not really interested in density of calls, but we want to convert this back into density of animals, and we're going to look into this next. How can we convert call density to animal density? We started out by saying that animals make a bunch of calls during the day or sampling occasion. What if we could estimate somehow how many calls they make on average during the day? We refer to this as the call rate. How many calls does an animal make per unit time, for example, per occasion? Then we could simply divide call density by the call rate to obtain animal density. In this example shown here, we have 3 animals, each calling 3 times per day. So if we knew this somehow, that each animal was making 3 calls per day, we could replace call rate with 3 in this equation. So as we generally do not know this, we need to estimate it somehow. So we have an additional parameter to estimate, and that's the call rate. What we do have is an estimate of call density, which is 9 calls per hectare per day. And this, combined with the estimate of call rate, allows us to get an estimate of animal density, which is 3 animals per hectare. Note that animal density is given without a time unit, whereas call density is given with a time unit. We've just seen how this works with a very simple example. In reality, things are not that simple, and there may be a great deal of variability between animals in terms of how many times they call within a day. So we need a bigger sample size to estimate this reliably. Also, some animals do not call on the day you collected the sample, but this is an important point. These animals should be included in your estimation, as in this way, call rate accounts for the proportion of animals not calling in a day, as opposed to what is the call rate given that the animals call. So for more details on this, please have a look at the chapter defining the detection unit. For now, let's get back to this example and see how we can estimate call rate from these data. Remember, this is a theoretical example and only serves illustrative purposes and not recommendations about sample size. Sample size is an advanced topic which we'll cover in a later lecture. Let's say we followed these 10 animals for a whole day and recorded each call that they made. Please note that I specifically said we followed these animals. You cannot simply use your SCR data for this. It could potentially be done, however, it would get quite complicated and is an advanced topic. So all in all, these 10 animals made 27 calls during that day. This includes the animals that did not make any calls. So we can estimate call rate from this simply by plugging in the numbers and get a call rate estimate of 2.7 calls per day per animal. We've just seen that using calls as a detection unit adds a level of complexity and that we need to estimate call rate. Let's talk a bit about about the benefits of acoustic surveys. Acoustic detection might allow us to detect animals at further distances compared to visual detection, and in this way it increases the sample size. When you use calls as the detection unit, you don't have to match calls to animals or groups of animals, which can be quite tricky if you do not see the animals. It can be non-invasive in various ways. When surveying in the dense forest, the fact that you can hear animals from far away allows you to survey by standing at listening posts for the duration of your sampling occasion. If you were to rely on visual cues in this situation, you would not be able to cover much ground and would likely have to switch to a different method called line transect surveys, where you would need to travel along the line, likely making a lot of noise. So standing at listening posts is a lot less invasive and a lot less likely to alter the animal's natural behavior. But even better, if you're able to use acoustic recorders to record the animal's sounds over long periods of time, which can be left in the field, you don't even really need to be there. You will be able to collect lots of data for very little money, making the method potentially very efficient. Using acoustic recorders is a method that is currently in development. This leads us to the question, should we use animals or calls as the detection unit? Well, for gibbons, it would be very hard to use individual animals, so animal groups with distinct territories are generally the choice over individual animals. However, you still have to make a choice between groups versus calls as the detection unit. So this table lists some of the things you need to consider in your choice. If you decide to go with groups as a detection unit, you still need to be able to attach calls to the individual groups. You also need to decide if you choose groups during a single occasion or during multiple occasions. When using groups during a single occasion, you will need to estimate the proportion of occasions during which a group calls as not every group calls on every day. When choosing groups during multiple occasions, you need to link groups across occasions. This means you need to be able to say, for example, group 1 from day 1 is the same as group 1 from day 2. So when using calls as the detection unit, the benefit is you don't need to attribute calls to animals or groups, as we've just learned in this lecture. But on the other hand, you need to estimate call rate. That's the additional complexity here. So here are some key points to take away. Animals might be detected by the sounds, for example, the calls they produce. Calls can be used for creating mark recapture events at different detectors. And we can use the capture history of calls to estimate call density. Call density can be converted into animal density if we know or can estimate call rate.